Good morning. Please, I will invite you to take your seats, and our friends from the media, if you would be kind enough to leave the room. Thank you. Thank you. We want to start on time, please, so if you will be kind enough to leave the room. So good morning, Your Excellencies, and welcome to the 2026 Ministerial Roundtable held as part of the Global Labour Market Conference. It is the third iteration, and we are delighted to welcome 37 speakers representing 35 countries, including the host country, of course, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. My name is Richard Atiyas, Chairman of the FI Institute Executive Committee and Acting CEO of FI Institute. So over the course of just a few years, the GLMC Ministerial Roundtable has evolved into a dedicated platform for global labour market policy maker engagement, enabling substantive policy dialogue. It optimized the conference standing as a global impactful convening of decision makers who define the labour market of tomorrow. So the roundtable is held under Chatham House rules, which means what we'll say in this room will stay in this room. So each contributor around the table will deliver a statement of up to 2 minutes. So please don't oblige me to be a bad boy and to stop your speech, because in the interest of ensuring there will be the time for everybody to give a statement. So please, may I ask you again that you respect the time. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to invite as the first speaker our host, His Excellency Engineer Ahmed bin Sulaiman al-Rashi, Minister of Human Resources and Social Development, Saudi Arabia, to take the floor. Your Excellency, please.
Thank you. Your Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, thank you for joining this Ministerial Roundtable at the third edition of the Global Labour Market Conference. It is a pleasure to welcome you, and I appreciate your time and participation. This roundtable is intended to foster a constructive exchange among ministers and senior leaders centered on practical experiences in today's labor market issues, where continued collaboration can help deliver real results. Our conversation takes place at a moment when many of us already understand the forces shaping labor markets. In our respective countries, we have invested significant effort in defining strategies and reform agendas. The challenge we increasingly face is implementation. Esteemed guests, across regions, policies are in place, but pathways into work are not always fast or clear or accessible. For many people, especially young people and those navigating transitions, the gap between policy ambition and real opportunity remains wide. Closing this gap has become an urgent priority. This requires labor market policies that reflect how people experience change. This imperative is clearly reflected in the GLMC 365 publication, Youth Perspectives in Technology and the Future of Work, developed in collaboration with the World Bank. Young people describe technology as a source of opportunity, but also as a source of uncertainty. They speak about challenges entering the labor market, skills that do not always match available jobs, and hiring process that can feel distant or automated. They are also clear about what they need: practical skills, responsible use of technology, and fair access to opportunity. These perspectives remind us that labor market reforms must be grounded in lived experience. Ladies and gentlemen, around the world, countries are testing different approaches to shorten pathways to work. Some are strengthening links between education, training, and employer demand. Others are improving employment services using data to improve matching or supporting new forms of work and enterprises. These experiences show that success depends on strong institutions, coordination across governments, and close engagement with employers. In Saudi Arabia, under Vision 2030, we have focused on strengthening labor market institutions, expanding skills development, and increasing participation. Like many of your own efforts, this work continues to evolve and efforts lessons worth sharing. To guide our discussion, I would like to suggest 4 questions. Question number 1, how can employment policies better keep up with both workers' readiness and the economic opportunities available in different national and labor market contexts? Question number 2, from experience, what factors have proven critical in making employment interventions effective? Question number 3, as labor markets grow in complexity, what measures exist to identify and manage competing or contradicting labor market policies? Question number 4, how can countries collaborate through bilateral and multilateral frameworks to better match labor supply and demand across borders in mutually benefit ways, particularly in context of these global shifts? These questions are intended to support a practical, experience-based exchange. Your Excellencies, this roundtable is designed as a space for candid and constructive exchange. Its value lies in the experience you bring and the openness of the discussion. I encourage you to share what has worked in your context, where the challenges remain, and where cooperation can make difference. With that, I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I wish we had the whole day to answer to your questions, because this is a lot of, I would say, food for thought. So it's now my pleasure to invite my friend, Dr. Ahmed bin Abdul Jabbar Al-Yamani, the CEO of Takamul Holding, to the lectern. Doctor, the floor is yours.
Thank
the
you very
lectern
much.
is behind you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Good morning, Excellencies. In the coming 7 minutes, I'm going to try to summarize for you everything that we have learned at GLMC since inception until today. And I'm going to start with a simple story. The story says that for thousands of years, and until about 100 years ago, work was outcome-based. It was freelancing, it was personal, and there was no standard relationship between employers and employees. About 100 years ago, together with the Second Industrial Revolution, work started to become a standard relationship. People started to clock in and clock out, and that relationship started to be defined. A few decades later, regulators like yourselves started to intervene in this relationship and introduce pension, benefits, medical coverage, etc., etc. We started to see in the last 10 or 20 years that things are going back to where they were. There is a preference of going back to freelancing, a preference of going back to outcome-based, and a preference of going back to personal work, less regulated than it used to be. And that's the first story that drives some of our signals today. The 6 signals that I'm going to share with you as the outcome of the GLMC since inception until today is the output of what 320 experts shared with 13,000 experts in the audience, over 33 hours of content in multiple stages in the conference. And I'm going to go through them one by one. The first signal is about skills. We've started to see that employers are relying more and more on skills than degrees. And this is growing year after year after year. 2025 witnessed that employers are relying 85% on skills when they make recruitment decisions. The call for action out of this is simply that we need to start to standardize skills, identify what skills define an individual through skill passport, figure out ways to verify these skills, and use these skills across economies and across countries. The second signal is about labor capacity becoming a critical infrastructure. in all economies all over the world. This is very obvious and very clear when we look at shocks. Research shows that countries or companies or organizations that have the right skill mix within themselves recover from shocks 2.5 times faster than those who do not have the right skill mix. And if anything is true about today's world, is that it's full of shocks. When we don't have economic shocks, we have geopolitical shocks. When we don't have geopolitical shocks, we have climate shocks. When we don't have climate shocks, we have tariff shocks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So companies and countries and economies have to equip themselves with the right skill mix within themselves. And this simply requires upskilling individuals to the right requirements or attracting the right skills to your economies as necessary for the economic development of the individual economy or country. The third signal is about AI. For many years, any technological revolution that was introduced into an economy was always welcomed because it came with additional productivity, and that productivity replaced jobs slower than how much people got upskilled for the new jobs that were created with these technologies. So the upskilling was always faster than job replacement that was introduced by the technologies. This is not the case with AI. The job replacement caused by AI today is happening faster than how people can get upskilled to maintain or retain their employment. And the call for action out of this signal is that we need to change the way we skill. We need to change every skilling curriculum. We need to change every education degree. We need to change every training content so that we assume there is an additional brain in the room. Training has to be readjusted given there is AI in the room and not just the human brain. The fourth signal is also linked to AI. Companies and countries will be replacing people with AI and replacing them with robots. And this is going to happen at a faster speed than we assumed. This will simply mean inflated balance sheets. It will simply mean higher profits. It will simply mean that they can do what they have been doing with less input for the same output. And this is what made Elon Musk say, work is going to become optional. He's simply assuming that since companies are going to make more profit, that profit is going to help people achieve the same output without working. And this sounds like if I'm going to become richer, then probably everybody else is going to become richer. Sounds very much like Marie Antoinette when she said, "Qu'elle mange de la brioche." This is very wishful thinking. This is not the reality. The reality is jobs are going to be replaced, and governments and regulators have to figure out how to tax that additional productivity gain from technology early on before it becomes a God-given right for these companies. The fifth signal is about gig economy. 50% of Generation Z participants in the US labor market are there on a digital platform. $21 trillion of the global economy in a few years is going to come from platform economy. About 400 million people who are working today, more than 400 million people who are working today, are in some form of a digital platform. This simply calls for us to change our pension systems, our protection systems, and our labor policies to become hourly based, not full-time based. And that's a very important signal. The sixth signal is about data. For many years, we've been using labor market information systems to facilitate our work and to speed our service delivery to the individuals and to the employers. What we need to start doing with these systems is to use the data in them to guide our decisions, whether if they are policy-related or employment-related or skills-related or sector-related. In short, I'm going to summarize the 6 signals. First, choose skills over degrees. Second, acquire labor capacity before it becomes very difficult to do so. 3, upskill with AI in mind. 4, tax technology productivity gains early on before it becomes difficult to do so. 5, adjust pension benefits to become hourly based. 6, use data and intelligence to decide skilling, pension, sectors, and taxes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.